Hey guys, tonight we slip into a time when kings kept not only crowns and castles, but also lists. Grim little inventories of enemies, rivals, and traitors whose capture could change the fate of kingdoms. Picture it: a flickering torch, a heavy wooden table, a parchment rolled out across its surface, and a monarch dipping a quill into ink. One by one, names are scrawled down. Outlaws who defied royal power, knights accused of treason, wandering heretics who preached dangerous ideas. These were the medieval most wanted, people with a price on their heads, people who turned law into a chase and politics into survival. And tonight, you're walking beside them, tracing their paths through forests, castles, and secret courts, as if you're the shadow on their shoulder. Of course, you probably wouldn't survive this list. Let's be honest, the moment you stuck your head above a parapet, some angry archer would test your skull for arrow resistance. Still, it's more fun to explore from your bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this little midnight map of our strange community. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a muddy lane, boots sinking into the muck, and you imagine yourself in the 13th century. The world smells of wood smoke, tanneries, horse sweat, and unwashed humanity. Above the village roofs looms a keep, a stone fortress where the local lord holds sway. Behind those walls, parchments list names like a proto-FBI board. The king has his favorites and his enemies, and on those lists, people's lives tilt between comfort and catastrophe. Most wanted figures weren't common thieves, though thieves got their fair share of nooses. The most dangerous names belonged to people who challenged power. That's why monarchs kept hit lists, rebels who stirred entire regions to revolt, heretics who might drag the faithful away from the church, pirates who robbed royal treasuries, or even family members who threatened dynasties. Historians still argue whether these lists were about real threats or just paranoia dressed up in royal ink. But you can imagine the weight of such a record. If your name appeared, the whole machinery of the kingdom turned against you. Step closer, you hear the scratch of a quill. Imagine a king, maybe Edward I of England or Philip IV of France, muttering to himself as he adds names. The page already holds outlaws like William Wallace, knights of the temple accused of heresy, and a scattering of noble rivals. Some entries have crosses beside them, marking those already captured or executed. Some lines are smudged where the ink bled under sweaty hands. Others remain open-ended, unsolved mysteries waiting for capture. You think of it as a medieval wanted poster, but with fewer woodcuts and more word of mouth. A sheriff or bailiff might be handed a writ commanding him to arrest someone for treason against the crown. Rewards were offered: land, silver, pardons for lesser crimes. That's a quirky detail. You could literally earn forgiveness for your sins by ratting out someone else. A thief might erase his debt to society by betraying a rebel hiding in the woods. And betrayal, that's the heartbeat of these lists. Kings knew that rebels could rally armies, but what toppled them most often wasn't battle. It was being sold out by a friend, a relative, or a desperate companion. You'll see this again and again tonight. Remember that when we meet Wallace, when we follow Joan of Arc, when we trace the fate of vanished princes. But let's pause in this village square. A herald unrolls a parchment, his voice booming across the cobblestones. Hear ye? By order of the king, the outlaw Robin Hood, known to lurk in the forests of Nottingham, is declared traitor and enemy of the crown. Any man who brings him forth shall be rewarded in coin and favor. The crowd murmurs. Some cheer, hoping for justice. Others smirk quietly, knowing that Robin's men are already watching from the tree line, ready to loose arrows if anyone gets too bold. And you stand there wondering, is this list a protection for the kingdom or just a theater of power? Now, think of how fragile the royal grip was. Travel was slow, communication slower still. A king could rule London, but in distant shires, power belonged to whoever held the strongest sword. The most wanted lists were a way to extend royal reach into those shadows. It was like saying, even if I'm not there, my will is. And here are the people who must fall if my kingdom is to survive. A mainstream historical fact. Okay, here's one. In 1307, Philip IV of France famously ordered the arrest of every Templar knight in his realm. Hundreds of men rounded up in single coordinated dawn raid. That wasn't just a practical move. It was symbolic power, the king writing Templars across his list in letters, so large it spanned an entire order. But here's a quirky tidbit. Villagers whispered that the Templars hid treasure and secrets, so even as their names were written down as criminals, they were elevated into legends, fueling myths we still tell. And here's where historians still argue. Were the Templars truly guilty of heresy, or were they just too wealthy and inconvenient for Philip's comfort? As you wander this imagined road, you feel the layers of the hit list unfold. Some names are rebels, others religious dissenters, others pirates, others queens who dared too much. Each name is a story, and each story is a piece of how medieval power worked. For every outlaw hanged, another took their place. For every rebel silenced, another voice rose. Kings never finished their lists, they only grew them. You slip under a gatehouse now, and you imagine the guard eyeing you with suspicion. Maybe you're a messenger carrying a sealed parchment with fresh names. Maybe your own name is there, a smudge of ink between traitor and enemy. You shiver a little, even under your blanket, because the medieval world wasn't safe for anyone who stood out too much. But here's the strange part. Sometimes being most wanted gave people immortality. Robin Hood may not have existed as we picture him, but because someone somewhere was branded an outlaw, we've been telling his story for 7 centuries. William Wallace's rebellion failed. His body was literally dismembered, but he lives on in Scottish pride. Joan of Arc was burned as a heretic, but later canonized as a saint. The king's list might have been intended to erase people, but paradoxically, it often preserved them forever. So as you curl deeper into your pillow, imagine yourself at the edge of that parchment, peering at names that still glow faintly in medieval ink. You're not just reading a list, you're about to walk through it. Each name is a door, and we're stepping through them one by one tonight. You wander out of the smoky village square and onto a winding dirt road that disappears into the whispering trees. The oaks here stretch wide like watchful sentinels, their branches creaking in the evening wind. Birds rustle, leaves scatter under your boots, and somewhere far off you hear laughter, a rough, merry kind that belongs to men who know the forest better than sheriffs ever will. You know you've stepped into Sherwood, the hunting ground not just of deer, but of legends. And somewhere inside, the king's list is alive. The name scrawled in thick ink, Robin Hood, or at least some outlaw who inspired the tales we now repeat like a bedtime story. The proclamation called him traitor. The ballads sang him as hero. Which version you believe depends on whether you're the one guarding a wagon full of silver or the peasant with nothing but turnips to your name. The forest smells damp, full of moss and earth. You keep glancing over your shoulder, half expecting an arrow to streak out of the underbrush. Imagine traveling here in the 1200s, roadways barely more than muddy ruts, woods thick enough to hide entire gangs. Outlaws thrived because these forests were impossible to police properly. Sheriffs, even with armed men, couldn't cover every trail. Robin Hood wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of how fragile law really was outside the walls of Nottingham. Mainstream history fact here. The earliest known written references to Robin Hood pop up in English ballads from the late 14th century, like A Jest of Robin Hood. In them, he's already a trickster, bow in hand, stealing from the rich. But quirky tidbit, in some versions, he isn't exactly giving to the poor. Instead, he's mostly redistributing wealth to his band of merry men. Think of it less as charity, more as payroll. Historians still argue whether he was ever a single historical person or just a composite of countless outlaws who harassed royal officials in the Greenwood. You pull your cloak tight as you picture him, hood pulled low, eyes sharp, bowstring taut. Maybe he's laughing at you, whispering to Will Scarlet or Little John about the strange traveler who walks alone. You feel the forest closing in, the myth breathing down your neck. Here's the thing. The crown hated Robin Hood not because he stole a few sacks of grain, but because he undermined authority. When peasants sang ballads about him, they celebrated rebellion. That terrified kings more than any arrow ever could. Imagine being Edward II, hearing your subjects humming songs about an outlaw who mocked sheriffs, outwitted soldiers, and thumbed his nose at lords. That wasn't just entertainment, that was political protest, centuries before Twitter hashtags. And then there's the Sheriff of Nottingham, his name forever cursed to play the villain. You picture him sitting in his stone hall, sweating under heavy robes, frustrated as news arrives that another convoy has been ambushed. "Most wanted," he mutters, his voice dripping with annoyance. He posts rewards, promises pardons, swears to hang the outlaw high. Yet every time, Robin vanishes deeper into the forest, protected by villagers who prefer his justice to the crown's taxes. There's a soft sarcasm to all, because if you were a medieval peasant paying harsh levies for wars you'd never see, wouldn't you cheer for a rogue who stole a bit of that silver back? Still, here's your reality check. If you actually joined Robin's gang, odds are you'd end up hanged, quartered, or buried in an unmarked grave. The king's list wasn't forgiving. Most wanted men rarely enjoyed long retirements. The forest road twists, and suddenly you stumble into a clearing where a fire crackles. A dozen rough figures sit around it, sharing bread and roasted rabbit. One plucks a lute, the melody crooked but spirited. They glance up at you, wary, hands near daggers. Then one man, tall and broad, grins. "Loss are you?" he asks. You realize you've just walked into the heart of the legend. Their laughter is warm, but it hides danger. These are men living on the edge, hunted, betrayed, surviving one raid at a time. One wrong move, and you'd be stripped of your purse or your life. You hear Robin speak, voice steady but commanding. "The sheriff calls us outlaws. Let him. We write our own laws." And you almost believe him, even as you sense the tension in the air. This is freedom, but it's also exile. Quirky tidbit again. Some ballads portray Robin as devout, always respectful of the Virgin Mary, even attending Mass when possible. That image, outlaw but pious, was part of what made him palatable in medieval imagination. He wasn't godless, he was righteous. Yet historians still argue whether that piety was genuine folklore or a later softening of a much rougher criminal reputation. Now think about how names travel. Robin Hood may have been a stock alias. Legal records from the 13th and 14th centuries mention men actually called Robhod or Rabinod who had nothing to do with Sherwood, but whose names became shorthand for outlaws. It's as if once the King's List branded you Robin Hood, you were doomed to wear that mask forever, whether you wanted it or not. The fire pops, sparks spiraling into the dark. You lean back, feeling the weight of the forest. These men might vanish tomorrow, cut down by sheriffs or betrayed by villagers desperate for reward. Yet their names will echo. That's the strange irony. Being most wanted made Robin Hood immortal. Kings ruled for decades, we forget half their names. Outlaws roamed for a season, yet we still whisper them centuries later. One of the men passes you a cup of ale. It's bitter, earthy, the taste of survival. You raise it quietly, not daring to speak. Somewhere beyond the clearing, you hear hoofbeats, royal men on patrol. The band goes silent, hands tightening on bows. You feel the tension like a bowstring pulled to the edge of breaking. Then, with silent signals, Robin sends his men scattering into the woods. They move like shadows, vanishing in heartbeats, leaving nothing but embers behind. And you're alone again, heart racing, realizing you've walked through myth. You've seen how the King's List can twist a man into legend, how ink on parchment can spark centuries of ballads. As you drift back toward the road, you hear faint echoes of a lute. Maybe it's the wind, maybe memory, maybe proof that outlawry never dies. It just waits in the trees for another name to take up the hood. The forest air fades behind you, replaced by the open sweep of windswept highlands. Your boots crunch on heather and stone, and suddenly the world feels wider, harsher, and charged with a wild defiance. Scotland stretches before you, craggy mountains looming like watchmen, locks glittering like shards of sky. And here you hear another name echo from the King's List, William Wallace. The English crown labeled him traitor, outlaw, and most wanted fugitive. The Scots sang him as a hero, a giant with fire in his chest and steel in his hands. You step into his shadow, and the ground itself seems restless, as if rebellion still hums in the soil. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the roar of bagpipes, the thunder of feet across a wooden bridge, the clamor of men shouting freedom in accents thick and fierce. That's the sound of Wallace's rebellion, short-lived, bloody, and unforgettable. Mainstream historical fact first, Wallace truly existed, unlike our maybe fictional Robin Hood. Records confirm he led Scots against English rule in the late 13th century, most famously at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, where his forces, though fewer, used cunning and terrain to crush a larger English army. Stirling became his legend's heartbeat, proof that courage and cleverness could topple sheer numbers. But here's a quirky tidbit. The chronicles never actually describe Wallace in detail. The image of him as a towering, kilt-wearing warrior with blue face paint? That's later invention, popularized in poetry and, yes, Hollywood. The real Wallace might have looked like any other knight of the age, chain mail instead of tartan, practical instead of theatrical. Historians still argue whether his leadership was rooted more in military genius or in sheer desperation, the rebellion less a strategy and more a survival instinct. You trudge forward, and in your mind's eye you're standing at Stirling Bridge. Picture it, a narrow wooden span over the River Forth, strong enough for maybe 2 horsemen abreast. The English march confidently, thousands of them, armor gleaming in the morning light. Wallace and his ally Andrew Moray wait on the far bank, hidden behind marshes and scrub. Then, with timing so sharp it cuts, the Scots strike. They trap the English mid-crossing, hacking them down in chaos. The bridge groans, blood slicks the planks, men tumble screaming into the water. You flinch, though the battle happened centuries ago. The air stinks of iron, wet earth, and fear. And through it all, Wallace's name spreads. To the English, he's suddenly most wanted, a rebel capable of igniting Scotland into open revolt. To the Scots, he's not just a man, he's hope made flesh. You picture the parchment in Edward I's hall, the quill scratching as clerks scroll Wallace's name across royal orders. Capture him, dead or alive. Rewards offered, lands promised. It wasn't just about punishing him, it was about sending a message. No one defies the crown and lives long. But rebellion is rarely tidy. After Stirling, Wallace rose high, declared guardian of Scotland. Yet power makes enemies even among allies. Nobles distrusted him, envied him, questioned his legitimacy. Remember what I said about betrayal being the lifeblood of these lists. It's here again. You march beside him in the months that follow, the taste of smoke heavy as villages burn, the nights cold with exile. By 1298, Edward strikes back hard. At Falkirk, the English crush Wallace's forces with cavalry and longbowmen. The dream shatters in mud and blood. Wallace slips into the shadows, stripped of guardianship, forced into outlaw life once more. Here's another quirky thread. Some traditions claim Wallace disguised himself, wandering the countryside in secret, a hunted man eating with peasants, hiding in monasteries. Others say he left for Europe, seeking aid from France or even Rome. Historians still argue about those missing years. The records go quiet, then suddenly there he is, captured in 1305, betrayed by a fellow Scot named John de Menteith. There's that betrayal again, the King's List cashing in on loyalty traded for safety. Now brace yourself, because this is where Wallace's story burns brightest and darkest. Dragged to London, paraded through jeering crowds, accused of treason against a king he never swore allegiance to. His retort, according to legend, was sharp. I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject. You have to admire the cheek, even as you sense the doom pressing in. His execution is infamous. You've probably heard the gruesome details, though tonight we'll soften the edges. He was made a public spectacle, his body used as warning, his head displayed on London Bridge. Yet here's the twist, that very cruelty immortalized him. The King's List tried to erase him, but instead, Wallace became eternal rebellion. You step back from the vision, the chill of London fog clinging to your cloak. You hear peasants whispering his name in secret, ballads passed around firesides, each retelling bigger than the last. Wallace the giant, Wallace the saint, Wallace the ghost who rides the highlands on stormy nights. That's how legends work, pain sharpened into poetry. Now think about how strange this is. Kings wrote most wanted to destroy enemies, but time often flipped the script. Wallace became a national hero, the very soul of Scotland's independence movement centuries later. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. Powerful, yes, but ask the average dreamer at bedtime who they remember, and it's Wallace. You stand once more at Stirling Bridge in your imagination, the river dark under moonlight. You see ghostly figures charging, hear the clash of swords, feel the impossible surge of hope when the underdog wins. And you realize you've just walked alongside one of history's most hunted men, a name inked on the King's List, yet carved forever into memory. The path winds down from the highlands, and you find yourself crossing into the tangled heart of Europe. The hills soften, the forests thicken, and the roads are lined with merchants, pilgrims, and whispering monks. It feels different here, more ordered, more entangled in parchment and ink than in swords and axes. This is not the land of Robin Hood's bow or Wallace's claymore, but the arena of plots, creeds, and crusades. And here, another name rises from the King's List, Jan Hus. Yes, you heard right. Not a robber knight, not a warrior outlaw, but a preacher. Strange, isn't it? To be branded most wanted not for stealing gold or cutting throats, but for speaking words too bold for his age. But in the medieval world, ideas could be just as dangerous as blades, sometimes more. You step into Prague, the city of Huss's birth, cobblestones shining under torchlight. The air smells of smoke and ink, the murmur of Latin prayers mixing with the street cries of vendors. Imagine it, cathedrals looming over marketplaces, priests in golden vestments walking past barefoot beggars. It's here Huss begins to stir discontent, not by violence, but by asking questions. Mainstream fact first. Jan Hus was born around 1372 in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. He became a priest, a scholar, and eventually rector at Charles University in Prague. But unlike many clerics of his time, Huss didn't just parrot doctrine. Influenced by earlier thinkers like John Wycliffe in England, he challenged the corruption he saw in the church. Indulgences sold like market wares, priests living in luxury while their flocks starved, bishops wielding swords instead of psalms. That's where his danger lay. To criticize the church in the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't just social commentary. It was treason against God's earthly order. The Pope himself held political might. Kings bent their knees to him, and armies marched at his word. To question that system was to light a fuse under the throne of Christendom. Here's a quirky detail. Huss's name literally means goose in Czech. He often joked about it, even prophesied during his trial. You are now going to burn a goose, but in 100 years you will have a swan which you can neither roast nor boil. Many later reformers believed he predicted Martin Luther, who came almost exactly a century later. You see how legends recycle themselves, outlaws always leaving breadcrumbs for the future. But let's slow down and walk with Huss through his story. Imagine sitting in Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, where he preached not in lofty Latin, but in Czech, the language of the people. The crowd is a mix of peasants and artisans, their faces tired from labor, yet their eyes fixed on him as he rails against indulgences. His words cut sharper than any blade. How could a man forgive sins for coin? How can Christ's grace be measured in gold? The air in the chapel trembles with nervous excitement. Some nod, some cross themselves in fear. And somewhere, perhaps in the shadows, a spy for the archbishop scribbles notes to be sent to Rome. It doesn't take long. By 1411, Huss is excommunicated. His books are condemned, his name blackened. In a world where excommunication meant not just spiritual punishment, but social death, Huss becomes an outlaw, not with sword in hand, but with sermons on his lips. Picture the king's scribes writing his name on parchment orders. Jan Hus, heretic, most wanted. Not for brigandage, not for rebellion against a monarch, but for refusing to bow to papal decrees. Imagine the absurdity of it. Armed knights dispatched to silence a preacher with ink-stained fingers. You follow him into exile. He leaves Prague, retreats to the countryside, yet continues to write, to preach, to send letters aflame with defiance. His followers grow, calling themselves Hussites, forming a movement that blends faith with a fierce Czech identity. Already, you sense the inevitability. The more the authorities try to silence him, the louder his voice echoes. Isn't that always the way with these most wanted names? Kings and popes see rebellion as weeds to be plucked, but often they're planting seeds instead. By 1414, Huss is summoned to the Council of Constance, a massive gathering meant to end church divisions and restore unity. He's promised safe conduct by Emperor Sigismund. But if you've noticed a theme by now, you probably guess what happens next. Betrayal again. The promise is broken. Huss is arrested, chained, and tried for heresy. Let's pause here. Imagine yourself in the council hall. The air heavy with incense, bishops in fine robes seated in judgment, scribes scratching furiously to record every word. Huss stands alone, gaunt from imprisonment, his voice steady. Show me from Scripture that I am wrong, and I will recant. But they do not debate, they condemn. Here's another quirky footnote. During his trial, Huss reportedly declared that obedience to God outweighed obedience to any pope. A radical thought then, but one that still ripples through history. Even more curious, while many heretics before him tried to recant to save themselves, Huss stood firm. He would rather die than betray conscience. And so he did. Picture the scene outside Constance in July 1415. A stake driven into the ground, wood piled high, the crowd pressed in close. The executioner ties Huss to the post, the ropes cutting into his wrists. His goose prophecy lingers in the air as flames crackle upward. Some say he sang psalms as the fire consumed him. Whether myth or truth, it doesn't matter. The image remains, a preacher burned for daring to speak. And here's the kicker. Instead of extinguishing him, the fire spread. The Hussite wars erupted soon after, Bohemia plunging into decades of bloody rebellion. Armies rose under the banner of his memory, peasants wielding flails and war wagons against armored knights. Huss, the outlaw preacher, became Huss the martyr, Huss the banner of defiance. The church had wanted to erase him. Instead, they turned him into fuel for revolution. Now step back with me and notice the pattern across these most wanted souls. Whether it's Robin Hood stealing from sheriffs, Wallace defying kings, or Huss challenging popes, their crime is not simply what they did, but what they symbolized. Authority fears not just the act, but the idea behind it. Robin Hood represented justice, Wallace independence, Huss conscience. And you can't burn those ideas away. As you leave Constance, the smoke still clinging to your cloak, you hear the whispers already starting in taverns and streets. He died for truth. The goose is gone, but the swan will come. And you know the king's list has failed again. They hunted a man, but they created a legend. You walk on, deeper into the medieval night, the names of the hunted echoing louder than the names of their hunters. The parchment of the king's list grows longer, but so does the chorus of those who refuse to be silenced. The road you walk now bends southward, away from the smoke and the heretical flames of Constance, toward the glittering courts of France and England. The cobblestones under your boots seem smoother here, the wine flowing richer, the halls echoing with harp music and poetry instead of sermons. Yet don't be fooled. The velvet curtains hide daggers, and the crowns glittering above silken veils weigh heavy with suspicion. Tonight, the king's list doesn't name a ragged outlaw or a firebrand preacher. No, tonight it bears the name of a queen. Her name is Eleanor of Aquitaine. If the word Aquitaine makes you imagine vineyards, sunlit hills, troubadours strumming lutes under castle balconies, you're spot on. Eleanor was born in one of the most prosperous regions of medieval Europe in 1122. She inherited Aquitaine in her teens, instantly becoming one of the richest and most sought-after heiresses of her age. Imagine you at 16, suddenly holding lands stretching across southern France, with dukes and kings lining up to marry you. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But as you know by now, medieval fairy tales have sharp teeth. Here's a mainstream fact. Eleanor first married Louis VII of France, and later Henry II of England. That made her queen of two different kingdoms, back to back, a rare double crown in history. But Eleanor wasn't content to just sit quietly on a throne, embroidering cushions while her husbands ruled. No, she schemed, advised, quarreled, rebelled, and sometimes even fought. And that habit, her refusal to stay silent, earned her a place on more than one royal hit list. Picture her first as Queen of France. Louis VII is pious, serious, maybe even a little dull. Eleanor is witty, fiery, raised in the cultured courts of Aquitaine, where poets sang about courtly love and women played chess with politics. Their temperaments clashed like steel. When the Second Crusade was called in 1147, Eleanor didn't just wave goodbye at the castle gate. She went along. That's right. Picture her in armor, leading her vassals across Europe toward the Holy Land. Chroniclers sniffed disapprovingly, muttering about women and male riding side by side with knights. But Eleanor didn't care. She saw herself as equal to kings. Of course, the crusade was a disaster. Armies starved, morale crumbled, alliances broke down. And Eleanor, fiery as ever, openly quarreled with Louis on the journey. Some chroniclers even accused her of scandalous liaisons with her uncle Raymond of Antioch. Whether that's gossip or truth, historians still argue whether Eleanor's behavior was the spark that doomed the crusade, or merely a scapegoat for its failure. Either way, the marriage was doomed. By 1152, she and Louis divorced, an act rare and shocking in that era. But Eleanor wasn't about to fade into obscurity. Within weeks, she married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be Henry II of England. With this union, she carried Aquitaine into English hands, creating an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Imagine the French king's fury, his former queen now sitting beside his rival. Talk about medieval drama. At first, Eleanor and Henry were a power couple, energetic and ambitious. Together, they had 8 children, including future kings Richard the Lionheart and John. Yes, that John, the one forever cast as villain in Robin Hood tales. But passion burns hot, and so does temper. Henry was domineering, often unfaithful, and Eleanor chafed at being sidelined. She wanted influence over her lands, over her sons, over politics itself. Here's where she really earns her place on the most wanted roll. In 1173, Eleanor supported a rebellion of her sons against their father. That's right, she plotted with Richard Geoffrey and young Henry to overthrow King Henry II. Imagine the family dinners in that household. Henry eventually crushed the revolt, but betrayal by a queen and mother couldn't go unanswered. Eleanor was arrested, stripped of power, and imprisoned, kept under house arrest for nearly 16 years. 16 years. Imagine pacing the cold corridors of castles, guarded by knights who once bent the knee to you. She's not forgotten, but she's silenced. For Henry, Eleanor became both too dangerous to execute and too valuable to release, a royal paradox. Officially, she wasn't a criminal, but practically, she was on his most wanted list every day she drew breath. And yet, Eleanor was never truly broken. When Henry died in 1189, Richard ascended the throne and freed her immediately. Picture her at nearly 70 years old, suddenly released, stepping back into politics as if she'd only been away a week. She arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, and even governed England while Richard went gallivanting on crusade. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even in her later years, Eleanor personally rode across the Pyrenees to fetch a Spanish princess as bride for her son. 70-something, on horseback, crossing mountains. When most medieval nobles her age were praying quietly in monasteries, Eleanor was still in the saddle, commanding like a general. And here's the delicious irony. Though kings had tried to confine her, Eleanor outlived them all. She buried Louis, Henry, and even some of her own sons, remaining politically active into her 80s, a staggering age for the 12th century. Historians still argue whether Eleanor was truly a feminist pioneer, carving out agency in a male-dominated world, or simply another ruthless power player in a brutal age. Was she inspiring or calculating? A freedom-loving duchess, or a conniving queen who betrayed her husband and endangered her children? You can almost hear medieval chroniclers bickering like gossiping neighbors across the centuries. But to the kings of her time, the verdict was clear. Eleanor of Aquitaine was dangerous. Too clever, too independent, too unwilling to play the docile queen. And that's why she belonged on the king's list. Not because she stole purses or preached heresy, but because she refused to stay in her cage. As you leave her story behind, imagine the glow of torchlight on the walls of Poitiers, her court alive with troubadours singing verses of love and rebellion. She smiles in the shadows, always one step ahead, always untamable. And you, still walking the long midnight road, realize that sometimes the most wanted outlaw isn't a man with a sword, but a woman with a crown. The moon has shifted higher by the time your road bends westward across the rugged green hills and mist-cloaked valleys of Wales. The ground feels damp beneath your boots, the air thick with peat smoke and sea salt. And somewhere hidden among these valleys, a man moves like a shadow, never caught, never broken, always just beyond reach. His name is Owain, Glyndwr, and if the English kings had one name they scrawled and underlined on their most wanted lists in the early 15th century, it was his. Owain was not some ragged brigand or desperate peasant. He was born into the Welsh gentry around 1359, educated in law, even trained in London. For a time, he looked like the perfect loyal servant of the English crown, fighting under Richard II, studying the rules of courts and governance. But you know how the script goes by now. Loyalty in the medieval world was often rewarded with betrayal, and betrayal breeds rebellion. The mainstream fact first. In 1400, after a local land dispute spiraled into injustice, Owain declared himself Prince of Wales, reviving a title dormant since the crushing of Llywelyn the Last in 1282. That declaration wasn't just paperwork, it was an act of treason, rebellion, and wild audacity. Within weeks, he had gathered men from the hills, farmers with pitchforks, veterans with longbows, and nobles with grudges. A spark had caught in the heather, and soon half of Wales was ablaze. Now picture yourself trudging through a Welsh valley at dawn, fog curling around your ankles. Suddenly horns echo from the ridges, and armed men burst from the bracken. They're not bandits, they're Joan of Arc's followers, ragged yet fierce, their eyes bright with the fire of independence. They vanish into the hills as quickly as they appear. This is Glyndwr's genius, never facing the English army head-on, but striking and vanishing, using the landscape itself as ally. Guerrilla warfare medieval style. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one of his most dramatic victories, Glyndwr ambushed an English force at Pilith in 1402. Chroniclers claim that so many English knights fell that their corpses piled high, their banners trampled into the mud. Even stranger, one chronicler notes that ravens circled the battlefield for days, as if nature itself had sworn fealty to Glyndwr. Whether poetic exaggeration or eerie omen, it shows how deeply his legend already seeped into folklore. By 1404, Glyndwr was more than just a rebel, he was ruling. He held a parliament at Machynlleth, declared himself Prince of Wales officially, and even began planning a Welsh university system. Imagine it, a rebel leader thinking not only of war but of schools, governance, and lasting independence. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Wales might finally slip free of England's grasp. But here's where the debate swirls. Historians still argue whether Glyndwr truly had the resources to sustain independence, or if he was always doomed by England's sheer size and wealth. His alliances with France and Scotland helped, yes, but were they enough? Or was his rebellion destined to burn bright and fade? What isn't debated is how desperate the English crown grew to stop him. Henry IV and later Henry V poured troops into Wales, burning villages, hanging suspected sympathizers, laying waste to the countryside. Owain's name sat on the parchment of every royal order. Find him, capture him, end him. Yet he was never caught. Not once. Even after his forces dwindled, even after castles fell and allies deserted, Glyndwr himself vanished like mist. The last record of him alive is around 1412. After that, nothing. No capture, no grave, no neat ending for the king's scribes to record. Imagine the frustration of Henry V, conquering France, crowned in Paris, yet still haunted by a Welsh prince whose body was never displayed on a scaffold. Some stories say Glyndwr disguised himself as a shepherd and lived quietly until old age. Others whisper he found refuge with loyal kin, dying peacefully in obscurity. The truth? Lost to time. And that, of course, makes the legend only stronger. Let's pause here and think of the pattern again. Robin Hood, William Wallace, Jan Hus, now Owain Glyndwr. The authorities try to cage them, burn them, break them. But the harder the grip, the more they slip through the fingers of kings. Wallace was betrayed, Hus was burned, but Glyndwr? He simply disappeared. You can almost picture him chuckling in some hillside cave, listening to the shouts of English patrols searching fruitlessly in the mist. And here's another delightful tidbit. Welsh folklore still insists Glyndwr sleeps beneath the mountains, waiting to rise again when his people need him most. Like King Arthur, he's become a once-and-future figure, less man than myth. Try putting that on a wanted poster. You push onward through the damp, mossy woods, and the road feels quieter now, the weight of legends pressing around you. Somewhere in these hills, a prince declared freedom, defied kings, and then vanished without a trace. And you realize, sometimes the most dangerous outlaw is the one the crown can't catch, can't display, can't erase. Owain Glyndwr remains wanted not by kings anymore, but by the memory of his people. His name lingers like smoke in the valleys, a reminder that the king's list could never truly be completed. The path you've been walking twists again, drawing you out of the misty hills of Wales and toward the darker veins of Europe, where castles loom on cliffs and forests whisper with stories not meant for daylight. The names on the king's list change their flavor here. No longer princes or queens, no longer preachers or prophets. Now the wanted are wolves in human clothing, predators who stalked the roads themselves. And if you ask a weary traveler in a smoky tavern who the most feared names of the Middle Ages were, they'll tell you not about dukes or bishops, but about highwaymen and robber knights. Among them, one tale grows sharpest, the Devil of Dunster. Now, before you start imagining literal horns and fire, let's pause. Medieval nicknames were rarely polite. To be called devil wasn't always a statement about theology. It was shorthand for terror, ruthlessness, and infamy. And whoever earned that nickname had etched their crimes deep into the roads and valleys of England. Picture yourself in the 14th century, setting out on horseback with a purse of silver tied under your cloak. You pray before leaving the city gates because you know the highways are no safer than a wolf's den. Travelers vanish. Merchants are found stripped in ditches. Whole caravans are set upon by armored men who should have been knights of honor, not predators in plate. These were the so-called raubritter in Germany and their English cousins, lords turned outlaws, knights turned highway robbers, living off extortion, ambush, and ransom. The Devil of Dunster, his true name smudged by time, was said to haunt the roads of Somerset around Dunster Castle. Whether he was a disinherited noble, a disgraced knight, or merely a bandit who loved a good legend, no one quite agrees. What's certain is that his reputation spread like wildfire. A man who rode with black armor, face hidden, and demanded coin at sword point. Some swore his laughter echoed across the moors as he vanished into night. Here's the mainstream fact for our grounding. Dunster Castle itself was a Norman stronghold, perched high above the Bristol Channel, controlling the roads of western England. In the 13th and 14th centuries, that area was notorious for banditry, with nobles occasionally accused of running their estates more like criminal dens than feudal halls. The Devil of Dunster fits that mold perfectly, the outlaw whose identity blurred between rogue knight and local terror. But let's slip into the taverns for a moment, where travelers whisper their tales. I saw him with my own eyes. One swears ale sloshing. A black steed, eyes red as coals, and he vanished in smoke after cutting down my guard. Another insists he was mortal, a man, aye, but crueler than the grave. Took my brother for ransom, sent back his finger when we couldn't pay. Truth and myth weave together like wool on a spindle. And you, sitting in the corner, know the truth doesn't matter. In the Middle Ages, a name like Devil of Dunster was enough to freeze the blood and keep peasants indoors after dark. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval England had official outlawry laws. If a man was declared an outlaw, he wasn't just wanted, he was legally dead in the eyes of the law. Anyone could kill him without punishment. Imagine the royal parchment nailed at the marketplace reading, by order of the crown, the one called Devil of Dunster is outlawed. His life is forfeit. His capture rewarded. And yet, despite being dead, he kept riding, kept robbing, kept laughing. The crown hated men like him for two reasons. First, because they disrupted trade. Merchants stopped moving goods if they feared ambush. And second, because they mocked authority. If a king couldn't even control his highways, what good was his crown? So the devil's name must have sat near the top of that king's list, scribbled in angry ink. Historians still argue whether the Devil of Dunster was one man or a legend sewn together from the crimes of many. Was he a disgraced knight hiding in the woods? Was he an entire gang of bandits wearing the same Black Knight persona? Or was he simply a story invented by fearful villagers who needed a name for their misfortunes? Whatever the case, the king's scribes inked him into the rolls of infamy, and his shadow stalked the medieval imagination. Now close your eyes and imagine riding alone on that road, the sea wind in your face, the moonlight silver on the hills. You hear hoofbeats behind you, slow, deliberate, growing louder. Your horse shivers. You glance back, and there he is, a figure all in black, sword gleaming, demanding your purse with a voice like gravel. Maybe it's only a robber knight. Maybe it's something worse. Either way, you're about to part with more than a few coins. The crown's hunts for him became legendary themselves. Royal sheriffs dispatched patrols, knights rode out in shining armor, peasants were promised rewards for information. And yet, no matter how tight the net, he slipped through. Perhaps bribery helped. Perhaps fear kept lips sealed. Or perhaps he was simply too clever, vanishing into moorland caves and forest hollows. The harder the hunt, the wilder his legend grew. Here's another strange detail. Later ballads and folk tales from Somerset speak of a devilish rider who lured greedy men into ambushes, punishing the arrogant. Almost as if the Devil of Dunster morphed over time into a moral tale, a bogeyman parents warned their children about when greed outweighed caution. Isn't it fascinating how criminals often turn into cautionary spirits in folklore? A man once wanted by kings becomes a phantom teaching lessons in bedtime stories. But what became of him? Here, too, debate swirls. Some chronicles hint he was finally hunted down, cornered in the wild, and executed by the sheriff's men. Others claim he escaped overseas, becoming a mercenary in France. And still others whisper that he rode straight into hell one stormy night, thunder swallowing his laughter forever. Which ending is true? Maybe all, maybe none. The beauty of these most wanted tales is that the mystery keeps them alive. And as you leave Dunster behind, the castle's silhouette against the moon, you realize that some outlaws survive not because they dodge the king's noose, but because they slip into myth. The Devil of Dunster may have died centuries ago, but his name still flickers in the shadows of England's history, proof that once you're written on the king's list, you never quite leave it. The road darkens again, and the wind carries faint echoes of hoofbeats. You tighten your cloak and keep walking, because the next name waits just ahead. The night deepens, and as you walk, the air grows colder, not with the damp chill of forests or the lonely sweep of moors, but with the smoke of burning parchment and heretical whispers carried on the wind. You've left the bandit's lair and stepped into a world even kings tread carefully, the secret cellars, candlelit studies, and public pyres of those branded heretics. On the king's list, swordsmen and rebels are bad enough, but nothing unnerves authority more than people whose weapon is an idea. So tonight, you sit with the prey of the heretic hunters, scholars, dreamers, and firebrands like Jan Hus's spiritual cousins. They are men who ink their rebellion instead of drawing steel, women who brew charms when the church says no, thinkers who dare to say the world is not what Scripture claims. Their bodies may be frail, but their words can topple empires. First, let's ground ourselves in the mainstream fact. By the late Middle Ages, let's say 13th through 15th centuries, the Catholic Church was not just the spiritual guide of Europe, it was also one of its greatest political powers. To challenge the Pope's authority or the Church's teachings wasn't simply a theological debate. It was treason, sedition, and blasphemy all rolled into one. And kings, always eager to keep order, usually join the hunt. A king's writ of most wanted could be inked not just for murderers, but for people accused of holding the wrong beliefs. Imagine yourself in Paris around 1300, walking past the University of Paris, where scholars in long robes argue about Aristotle, the soul, and the nature of God. Most are safe within the boundaries of orthodoxy, but few push further, too far. What if the Bible isn't literal? One whispers. What if salvation doesn't come from Rome, but directly from God? These questions are sparks in a library full of dry parchment, and inquisitors are waiting with buckets of water and torches. You already met Jan Hus, burned in 1415. But rewind slightly and picture John Wycliffe in England, the morning star of the Reformation. In the 1370s, Wycliffe began translating the Bible into English so ordinary people could read it. Radical, right? Today you can pick up a dozen translations at a bookstore, but back then the scriptures were jealously guarded in Latin. Wycliffe's translation said, in effect, you don't need priests to tell you what God says. Read it yourself. Kings hated him. Popes hated him. But the people loved him. His followers, the Lollards, smuggled handwritten copies of the Bible like contraband wine. Some were caught and executed. Wycliffe himself died of a stroke in 1384 before the hunters could reach him, but his name was so dangerous that, decades later, church officials dug up his bones, burned them, and threw the ashes in a river. Imagine that level of fear, that even a dead man remained most wanted. In Bohemia, Huss's followers didn't die with him. The Hussites carried his defiance forward, holding secret services in forests and caves, chanting psalms while armed guards watched for patrols. For a while they even formed armies, peasants with wagon forts that humiliated knights in armor. But for every large-scale rebellion, there were dozens of quieter figures. Women accused of brewing healing potions that smelled too much like pagan charms. Scholars who muttered that the earth might not be the center of the universe. Even entertainers risked it. Jongleur who told jokes about priests in taverns could suddenly find themselves on wanted lists, their humor labeled heresy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some inquisitors were so paranoid they banned playing cards with certain images, fearing they hit heretical symbols. Imagine being dragged before a bishop and asked to explain why your deck of cards featured strange beasts. That's the level of suspicion that hung in the air. Picture yourself inside a stone hall, flickering with torchlight. A scholar stands trembling, ink still staining his fingertips. Before him, rows of stern-faced clerics read from a list of charges, denying indulgences, questioning the Trinity, mocking the Pope. The air reeks of wax and sweat. The scholar tries to speak. Show me from Scripture, but his words are drowned by shouts of heretic, apostate. Outside, the crowd gathers. Some are hungry for spectacle, nothing like a good burning to brighten an otherwise dreary week. Others shiver, crossing themselves, fearful the contagion of doubt might leap from the condemned to their own souls. The firewood is ready. The king's guards stand by. The preacher is dragged out, tied to the stake, and the flames lick skyward. You watch the smoke twist upward, and you realize this wasn't about silencing one man. It was about silencing the idea that kings and popes could be wrong. And here's the debate. Were all these heretics truly rebels against the faith, or were they simply scapegoats in a world that feared change? Some historians argue that inquisitors exaggerated the threat, making examples out of harmless thinkers to reinforce control. Others insist that these movements really did pose a danger, that if left unchecked, they could have shattered medieval society centuries before Luther and Calvin. Was Jan Hus simply a preacher who wanted a cleaner church? Or was he the fuse that could have detonated Christendom prematurely? Was Wycliffe a scholar translating words, or a revolutionary plotting to tear down Rome? Historians still argue whether these names belong on most wanted rolls because of their real power, or because of the crown's paranoia. Now, follow me into the back alleys and cellars. By candlelight, groups of believers gather. They pass around a smuggled scrap of Wycliffe's English Bible. They whisper prayers in their own tongue instead of Latin. A lookout peers through a crack in the wall, watching for the glow of torches. If the inquisitors come, the group could be fined, jailed, tortured, burned. Yet they gather anyway. This is the thing about the King's List. You can outlaw man, burn his books, erase his name. But you cannot erase hunger. And people hungered for meaning, for dignity, for a faith not shackled by corruption. That hunger kept the heretics alive long after their bodies turned to ash. Here's another quirky detail. In medieval joke books, yes, they existed. Priests were often the butt of satire. One common joke mocked friars for pocketing donations while preaching poverty. In a world where laughter could get you accused of blasphemy, even humor was a kind of heresy. Imagine being hunted not for swords or sermons, but for jokes told a little too loudly in the marketplace. That's how fragile authority felt. You keep walking, and the fires of Constance fade behind you, but the whispers remain. Even after centuries of burnings and bans, the heretics' words survive. Wycliffe's Bibles kept circulating. Husse's prophecy of a coming swan echoed until Luther appeared. And the King's List, for all its furious scribbling, never managed to capture what mattered most, the ideas. Because here's the truth. Swords can cut down rebels, prisons can cage queens, stakes can burn preachers. But ideas, they slip past guards, hide in cellars, and sleep inside the minds of peasants until the time is right. So you step out into the cold night once more, and the road stretches on. Somewhere up ahead waits another name, another outlaw, another face inked in the margins of the king's parchment. But the smell of smoke still clings to you, and you realize you've just walked through the most dangerous battlefield of all, the human mind. The road creaks beneath your boots, cobblestones giving way to softer earth. The night air tastes of iron, the kind that clings to weapons left too long in the rain. Ahead, the shadows sharpen into banners, spears, and mailed men whose names were whispered like curses in royal courts. You've walked through cells and pyres. Now it's time to meet the outlaws who didn't just write dangerous words, but carve their names into history with steel. These are the rebels and mercenaries, soldiers for hire, who turned loyalty into a business and crowns into bargaining chips. When kings spoke of their most wanted, it was often these figures, commanders without masters, knights who broke their oaths, armies of hardened killers ready to sell themselves to the highest bidder. Their presence was like a thundercloud over Europe. Dangerous, unpredictable, and guaranteed to ruin your day. Here's a fact to set the stage. By the 14th and 15th centuries, mercenaries weren't fringe actors. They were central to how wars were fought. Knights bound by feudal duty were romantic in theory, but unreliable in practice. So rulers turned to professionals, men who knew war like you know your morning commute. They formed free companies, bands of hundreds or even thousands who could fight for France one year, pillage Burgundy the next, and then sell themselves to Italy's city-states. Picture the most dreaded, most wanted poster of them all. Not a face, but a banner black and red, carried by a company that might sweep down on your village tomorrow. These weren't lone wolves, they were wolf packs. Let's focus on one of the most famous names, Sir John Hawkwood. An Englishman who fought in the 100 Years' War, Hawkwood eventually led the White Company, a feared mercenary force in Italy. Their name was ironic. Their deeds were anything but pure. The White Company left towns smoldering, peasants starving, and lords bankrupt. Yet Italian rulers kept hiring them, because if you didn't employ Hawkwood, your enemy would. Quirky tidbit here. Hawkwood was so famous in Italy that the city of Florence eventually gave him a state funeral. His fresco still decorates the Duomo. Imagine being so most wanted that you end up on both wanted lists and honor rolls. It's like being remembered as both the villain and the savior in the same play. If Hawkwood was Italy's nightmare, France had Bertrand du Guesclin. Nicknamed the Black Dog of Broceliande, he began as a brawler and rose to become one of France's most effective commanders against the English. But his early career? Pure mercenary work. He led bands of routiers, plundering companies infamous for raiding towns when not employed. Kings loathed and loved men like him. Du Guesclin could terrorize peasants one month and save France the next. He embodied the paradox of the mercenary, indispensable yet uncontrollable. Historians still argue whether Du Guesclin's dog reputation came from his loyalty to France or his sheer tenacity in turning any fight, even brawls in taverns, into bloodbaths. Was he truly a national hero, or just a mercenary who happened to side with the crown at the right moment? Step into the narrow alleys of Milan, and you'll meet the bravi Italian mercenary enforcers who became infamous in Renaissance tales. These were less soldiers and more professional thugs. Wealthy lords or ambitious merchants hired them to intimidate rivals, stab enemies, or persuade stubborn debtors. Picture a medieval mafia, cloaked in velvet, but carrying daggers under their cloaks. They were most wanted in every sense, hunted by city guards, cursed in sermons, yet constantly protected by the very nobles who used them. It's the eternal loop: outlaw by day, honored guest at court by night. Now shift to the Alps. Out of those craggy valleys came the Swiss mercenaries, perhaps the most disciplined killers of the late Middle Ages. Armed with long pikes, they marched in dense squares, mowing down knights like dominoes. Every crown in Europe wanted them and feared them. Their fame grew so great that eventually they weren't just mercenaries, they became the Pope's personal bodyguard. Yes, the Swiss Guard in Vatican City today traces back to these most wanted warriors for hire. Imagine that arc, from marauding free companies to the polished halberdiers in striped uniforms tourists snap photos of. Let's pause for a human scene. Imagine you live in a small village on the road between Florence and Pisa. It's harvest time. Then word comes. Hawkwood's White Company is marching nearby. Panic spreads. You hide your grain, herd your animals into the forest, and pray. But the mercenaries arrive anyway. They demand food, money, shelter. Refuse, and your thatched roofs will be torched. Comply, and you'll starve later. For peasants, mercenaries were a plague. For kings, they were a double-edged sword. For the men themselves, just another day's pay. Here's the scholarly debate. Were mercenaries simply a symptom of weak kingship, or were they a natural evolution of medieval warfare? Some argue that without them, kingdoms like France and Florence would have collapsed under foreign invasions. Others insist that mercenaries prolonged wars, feeding off instability, making peace impossible. It's like arguing whether fire is useful or destructive. You can cook with it or burn down your house. Kings wanted control, but mercenaries thrived in chaos. Strange as it sounds, many mercenary bands had their own internal rules. They divided loot by strict formulas, punished deserters, and sometimes even spared churches sometimes. It wasn't morality, it was practicality. A company that lost discipline was worthless. Quirky tidbit: some mercenaries demanded written contracts so detailed they included how much wine they'd be supplied each week. Yes, imagine drafting a medieval HR agreement that included your beer ration. That's how professionalized this chaos was. Picture yourself as a 14th century monarch. Your treasury is thin, your nobles unreliable. The enemy's army is approaching. Do you hire mercenaries? If you do, you risk them turning on you later, demanding higher pay or raiding your lands. If you don't, your castle might fall. Every king who inked names on his most wanted list had faced this dilemma. And often he scribbled the same name in both columns. Wanted dead 1 year, wanted hired the next. As dawn begins to smear the horizon, you realize something. Mercenaries weren't accidents. They were the heartbeat of late medieval war. They blurred the line between outlaw and hero, predator and protector. Their legacy still lingers. The idea that war could be a trade, not just a duty, reshaped Europe. And just like the heretics' words, the mercenaries' swords left echoes that stretch forward. The very concept of a professional army owes something to these feared, hunted, and endlessly needed men. So you trudge on, leaving the trampled fields behind, the sound of iron-shod boots fading into memory. Ahead lies another kind of outlaw, not a scholar or a swordsman, but rulers themselves, kings and queens who ended up most wanted by their peers. But for now, the clang of mercenary steel still rattles in your ears, reminding you that sometimes the crown's worst enemies weren't across the border. They were on its payroll. The path winds uphill now, and you feel the weight of your steps as though each stone carries a crown's worth of history. You've met scholars who defied scripture, rebels who sold their swords, and prophets who burned for their words. But tonight, you step into palaces where the enemies of the realm were not lurking in shadows, they were seated on thrones. Yes, the king's most wanted list could even bear the names of fellow kings and queens. Because in medieval Europe, the line between ruling and rebelling was razor thin. Some monarchs clawed for power so fiercely that even their peers branded them criminals. Some queens played politics so dangerously that exile, capture, or execution followed. And some rulers, once adored, became hunted figures, chased by the very people who once bowed to them. So settle in, because tonight you aren't stalking rebels in forests, but sipping poison wine in courtly halls where daggers hide beneath velvet sleeves. Let's begin with England. Richard II, grandson of Edward III, was crowned as a boy and grew into one of the most complicated kings England ever had. His reign began with flashes of brilliance. Think of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when teenage Richard rode out to meet an angry mob, and with sheer bravado, promised reforms that briefly saved the crown. Bold, right? But over time, Richard turned brittle. He loved pageantry and art, but when it came to politics, he grew paranoid, lashing out at nobles who opposed him. By the 1390s, Richard had imprisoned or executed so many of his enemies that Parliament and the aristocracy saw him as a tyrant. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke seized the throne in 1399, becoming Henry IV. And Richard? He went from wearing a crown to being a prisoner in Pontefract Castle. Most wanted in reverse. Instead of chasing rebels, the king himself was declared illegitimate. Some say he starved to death, others whisper he was murdered. Historians still argue whether Richard was truly a tyrant or just a sensitive soul caught in the brutal machinery of medieval politics. Now, let's rewind a century. Picture Isabella of France, queen consort of Edward II of England. History remembers her with one of the juiciest nicknames ever, the She-Wolf of France. Why? Because she turned against her husband and allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, to invade England. Edward II's reign was already shaky. He lavished power on favorites like Piers Gaveston and later the Despensers, angering the nobility. Isabella, neglected and insulted, decided enough was enough. In 1326, she and Mortimer led an invasion that toppled Edward. For a brief period, Isabella ruled England through her young son, Edward III. But power is a dangerous bedfellow. Eventually, Edward III turned against his mother and Mortimer, having Mortimer executed and Isabella sidelined. Imagine the spectacle: a queen once crowned, later whispered about as a conspirator and traitor, her name etched on most wanted lists both in court gossip and in chroniclers' accounts. Quirky tidbit: when she died, Isabella asked to be buried with Edward II's heart placed on her chest. Was it guilt, love, or just good theater? Historians still puzzle over it. Hop across to the Holy Roman Empire. In 1076, Henry IV, embroiled in the investiture controversy with Pope Gregory VII, found himself excommunicated. Suddenly, the emperor was declared most wanted, not by another king, but by the church itself. His vassals were told they no longer owed him loyalty. To save his throne, Henry famously walked barefoot in the snow to Canossa in 1077, begging the Pope's forgiveness. Imagine an emperor, ruler of lands stretching from Germany to Italy, shivering outside in a linen tunic while a pope kept him waiting for 3 days. Humiliation turned into survival, but Henry never truly regained trust. He spent years fighting rebellions and was eventually deposed by his own son. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Henry IV a tragic victim of papal overreach, or was he simply too stubborn and politically clumsy to manage the crisis? Historians still argue, but the image of an emperor humiliated in the snow has never faded. Next, let's travel to Italy. Queen Joan of Naples, ruling in the mid-14th century, was one of the most controversial monarchs of her time. Married young to Andrew of Hungary, she was accused of arranging his murder in 1345. The truth? Still debated, but suspicion clung to her like perfume. Hungary invaded Naples in retaliation, branding Joan a criminal queen. She fled, rallied support, and reclaimed her throne. Later, she was accused of supporting heretics during the Great Schism, backing the Avignon papacy against Rome. Eventually, her cousin Charles of Durazzo captured Naples and ordered Joan strangled in 1382. From crowned queen to hunted exile to strangled prisoner, Joan's life reads like a tragedy. Mainstream fact: she reigned for nearly 40 years. Quirky tidbit: she was once praised for her beauty and charm, called the Darling of Naples, which makes her villainous reputation all the more ironic. Historians still argue whether she was guilty of Andrew's murder or simply the scapegoat of ambitious rivals. Now turn your steps northward. David II, son of Robert the Bruce, spent much of his reign as a fugitive. After the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, Scotland was plunged into chaos, and young David fled to France. For 7 years, the King of Scots was a wandering exile, technically most wanted by the English crown. Even after returning to Scotland, David's reign was turbulent. He was captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346 and spent 11 years in English captivity. During this time, the Scots had to pay a crushing ransom for his release. David's story is a reminder that medieval kings were not invincible. One moment on a throne, the next a bargaining chip in someone else's hands. What's fascinating is how quickly power could flip. A monarch could be crowned with sacred oil one year and declared a traitor the next. Most Wanted didn't just apply to bandits or heretics. It applied to rulers who broke the unwritten contract with their people, their nobles, or the church. Historians still argue whether medieval kingship was truly absolute or always conditional. Was the crown a divine right untouchable, or was it really just a fragile deal between ruler and ruled? The number of dethroned, exiled, or executed monarchs suggests the latter. Imagine the scene: a deposed king paraded through streets in rags while crowds jeer. A queen locked away in a convent, her jewels stripped, her attendants dismissed. A once proud ruler begging for mercy before their cousin or child. These spectacles weren't just punishments, they were political theater. They warned everyone watching, no one is untouchable. Quirky detail: some dethroned monarchs were forced to publicly abdicate while holding a broken scepter, symbolizing their loss of divine authority. Talk about dramatic stage props. So as you leave these glittering, treacherous halls behind, you realize that the king's most wanted parchment was not just about rebels and bandits. Sometimes it was a mirror. Sometimes the names inked there were crowned heads themselves, outlaws in ermine cloaks, fugitives with royal seals still dangling from their necks. You walk on, the torchlight of palaces fading, and wonder who's truly safe in a world where even kings can become quarry. The road leads onward towards zealots who believe their visions outranked crowns and scriptures alike. And you know by now, if the heretics burned hot, the zealots burned even hotter. The road stretches ahead, narrowing into a dark lane lined with withered hedgerows. You've left behind the echoing halls of monarchs and their glittering betrayals, and now a different kind of fire calls you forward. Not the polished ambition of kings or queens, but the raw, untamed blaze of zealots. These are the most wanted who believe not just in rebellion, but in divine mission. To them, crowns and papal decrees meant nothing if they clashed with what they believed was God's command. And when people like that gather followers, kingdoms tremble. The king's list was thick with such names. Prophets who declared themselves chosen. preachers who whipped crowds into frenzies, sect leaders who claimed visions so powerful that peasants, soldiers, and even knights abandoned their duties to march under banners stitched with scripture. Tonight, you're walking into their campfires, hearing their chants, and feeling the weight of faith sharpened into a weapon. First, picture Europe in the mid-14th century. The Black Death rages, killing perhaps a third of the continent. Panic, despair, and confusion swirl through towns. Into this chaos stride the flagellants, bands of men who believe the plague is God's punishment and that salvation can only come through public penance. You hear them before you see them, chants of hymns in cracked voices, punctuated by the snap of whips. They march barefoot, wearing white robes marked with red crosses, flogging themselves with knotted cords tipped with iron spikes. Blood runs down their backs, dripping onto cobblestones. Crowds gather, some joining in, others weeping, still others whispering in fear. At first, many welcomed them, believing their sacrifices might draw God's mercy. But soon kings and popes saw them as threats. They preached without permission, stirred riots, and sometimes attacked Jews, blaming them for the plague. Pope Clement VI officially condemned them in 1349, ordering their dispersal. Yet the flagellants kept marching for decades. Quirky tidbit: some chroniclers claim entire towns joined processions, leaving shops and fields abandoned for days. Imagine your medieval boss saying, "Sorry, can't harvest wheat this week. I need to go whip myself in the marketplace." Historians still argue whether the flagellants were truly dangerous radicals or simply desperate people trying to make sense of catastrophe. Either way, they made the most wanted lists of both kings and bishops. Remember Jan Hus from earlier? After his death, moderate followers wanted reform within the church. But radicals known as the Taborites took things further. Named after their fortified town of Tabor in Bohemia, they rejected not just the Pope, but much of traditional hierarchy itself. They preached equality, rejected feudal lords, and even envisioned a society where no one owned private property. Picture it, medieval communism for centuries before Marx. They also embraced apocalyptic visions, believing Christ's second coming was near. Militarily, they were terrifying. Their wagon forts could repel even heavily armed knights, and they carried banners declaring, "Truth prevails." To kings and bishops, they weren't just heretics, they were revolutionaries threatening to upend the entire social order. Mainstream fact: in 1434, the more moderate Hussites joined Catholic forces to crush the Taborites at the Battle of Lapani. The radicals were slaughtered, yet their ideas echoed, shaping later movements like the Anabaptists. Now, let's turn to France in 1251. A ragtag army forms, not knights or noblemen, but peasants, shepherds, and farmers, led by self-proclaimed prophets. This was the Shepherds' Crusade, a bizarre outburst of zealotry that began with the claim that God had chosen simple folk, not nobles, to free the Holy Land. Tens of thousands marched, carrying staffs and crosses, chanting that the Virgin Mary guided them. But instead of heading east, they began rioting at home, attacking clergy, storming towns, and sometimes targeting Jewish communities. What began as a crusade became an uncontrollable revolt. Kings quickly branded them criminals. Chroniclers described troops sent to scatter them, with leaders executed as impostors. Yet the very fact that thousands followed them shows how deep popular resentment and hunger for justice ran. Quirky tidbit: some sources say they carried sheep bells around their necks, ringing as they marched. Imagine a battlefield where instead of trumpets, you hear the jingling of sheep bells before the chaos begins. Fast forward to the 1490s in Florence. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar, preaches fiery sermons denouncing corruption, luxury, and vice. His voice booms in cathedrals, warning of God's wrath. Crowds flock to him, convinced he speaks divine truth. He organizes bonfires of the vanities, where people throw cosmetics, fine clothes, and even artworks into flames. Under his influence, Florence briefly transforms into a kind of theocratic republic. But soon, his extremism alienates allies. In 1498, the Pope excommunicated him, and Florentines turned against him. He was hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where his bonfires once roared. Historians still argue whether Savonarola was a visionary reformer or just a dangerous fanatic. Mainstream fact, his sermons influenced later reformers like Martin Luther. Quirky tidbit, supposedly, children patrolled the streets during his rule, scolding adults for gambling or wearing fancy clothes. Imagine a medieval youth police telling you to hand over your dice. Over in the Byzantine world, zealotry had another face. In the 1340s, during a civil war, a radical group called the Zealots seized control of Thessalonica, the empire's second-largest city. They expelled aristocrats, redistributed property, and ruled for nearly a decade, calling themselves defenders of the poor. For Byzantine emperors, this was a nightmare, a major city run by a populous mob. The Zealots became most wanted not just for rebellion, but for daring to imagine society without its traditional ruling elite. Eventually, imperial forces retook the city, and leaders were executed. But the memory of their rule lingered like smoke after a fire. So what ties these figures together? Whether flagellants, Taborites, shepherds, or Savonarola, they all believed they were chosen. Their visions weren't polite suggestions, they were divine mandates. To them, opposing rulers or bishops wasn't treason, it was obedience to God. But to kings and popes, such people were nightmares. You can bribe a mercenary, outfight a bandit, or silence a heretic. But how do you stop someone convinced the Almighty is on their side? That's why zealots ended up on most wanted lists, often with their entire movements outlawed alongside them. Now imagine being an ordinary villager caught in their wake. Maybe you see flagellants marching through your town, blood dripping onto the dirt, or a shepherd shouting prophecies in the marketplace, urging you to join, or Savonarola's followers hammering at your door, demanding you throw your jewelry into the flames. Would you join, fearing God's wrath if you refused? Or would you hide, praying the storm passes? For millions of medieval people, zealotry wasn't an abstract debate, it was a knock at the door. Here's the big scholarly debate. Were these zealots genuinely dangerous revolutionaries, or were they simply voices crying out against corruption in an age of crisis? Some argue they kept medieval society from rotting by forcing rulers to confront their sins. Others claim they spread chaos, violence, and fear without offering real solutions. Were they visionaries or villains? Historians still argue, and perhaps always will. You leave behind the sounds of whips and sermons, the smell of smoke and blood. The zealots fade into the night, their chants echoing in your ears. Ahead lies a new kind of danger, not rebels with swords or prophets with visions, but shadows who struck from behind, assassins whose daggers carved their own entries into the king's deadly ledger. And as you walk, you glance over your shoulder, because this time the danger isn't marching in the streets. It might already be following you. The torchlight flickers against stone walls as the road narrows into silence. Gone are the chants of zealots and the roar of bonfires. Now, the night feels heavier, filled with the weight of secrets. You're not in the middle of a battlefield anymore, nor in a square where prophets thunder against kings. Instead, you walk in alleyways where whispers matter more than banners, and where a dagger can change the course of history faster than an army. This is the world of medieval assassins, the shadows on the king's most wanted list who slipped past guards, scaled towers, and slid into chambers while rulers slept. To many, they were cowards. To others, they were avengers. Either way, they carried blades that wrote history not in ink, but in blood. If we're talking about medieval assassins, we have to begin with the infamous Nizari Ismailis, better known in the West simply as the Assassins. Based in mountain fortresses across Persia and Syria, They were followers of Hassan I Sabbah, a charismatic leader who died in 1124, but whose legend grew larger than life. The assassins earned their name from the Arabic word hashishin, often mistranslated as hashish eaters, though historians now think that was slander spread by their enemies. In truth, they were disciplined, highly trained killers who relied not on drugs but on stealth, loyalty, and terror. Their most famous base was Alamut Castle, perched high in the mountains. From there, the so-called Old Man of the Mountain directed his followers, sending them on missions to eliminate political and military opponents, sometimes even in the heart of enemy strongholds. What made them truly terrifying was their style. They didn't storm castles or wage war in open fields. They slipped into camps disguised as servants, monks, or even soldiers. Then, at the right moment, often in public, they struck with daggers. They rarely killed ordinary folk, only high-value targets, viziers, generals, even princes. One chilling detail. Sometimes they wouldn't even kill, but instead leave a dagger on a pillow beside a sleeping enemy as a warning. Imagine waking up to that in the middle of a fortress guarded by 100 men. Mainstream fact. At their height, the assassins eliminated several major Crusader leaders and Muslim rivals, including Conrad of Montferrat, who had been elected King of Jerusalem in 1192. His death threw the Crusader states into turmoil. Quirky tidbit. Marco Polo later exaggerated tales about them, claiming young recruits were drugged, taken to a lush garden filled with women and delights, then told it was paradise. When they awoke, they were convinced obedience to their master would bring them eternal bliss. Modern historians doubt the details, but the story stuck and gave us the word assassin. Not all assassins belonged to secret orders. Some were knights, driven by loyalty and rage. The most famous case, the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. King Henry II of England and Becket had once been close friends. But when Becket became Archbishop, he began resisting the king's attempts to control the church. Their quarrels grew bitter, and one day Henry supposedly shouted, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether he meant it or not, for knights took him literally. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral, cornered Becket at the altar, and hacked him down with swords. Chroniclers say the final blow split his skull so deeply that brain matter spilled onto the floor. The murder shocked Christendom. Becket was hailed as a martyr, canonized by the Pope just 3 years later. Pilgrims flocked to his shrine, and Henry himself had to do public penance, walking barefoot to the cathedral and being whipped by monks. From the king's perspective, the knights were loyalists who carried out what they thought was his will. From the church's perspective, they were assassins who desecrated holy ground. Their act reshaped English politics for decades. In the Byzantine Empire, assassination wasn't just an occasional scandal, it was practically part of the job description. Emperors were toppled, blinded, strangled, and poisoned so often that some historians joke the imperial palace was less a throne room and more a revolving door. One striking case, Emperor Andronikos Ikomnenos, R. 1183 to 1185. He seized power through intrigue, ruling with cruelty and paranoia. Eventually, his enemies captured him, dragging him through the streets. Before executing him, they cut off his hand and gouged out his eye. His downfall came not through battle, but through betrayal and mob justice, a pattern that haunted Byzantium again and again. In this world, assassins weren't lone killers in hoods. They were senators, generals, even family members, all willing to plunge the knife if it meant a chance at the purple robes. Travel to the late medieval Netherlands, where William of Orange, known as William the Silent, led resistance against Spanish rule. In 1584, he became one of the first heads of state assassinated with a handgun. His killer, Balthasar Gerard, was a devout Catholic who believed William was a heretic and traitor. Gerard shot him at close range inside his own residence in Delft. Though executed brutally soon after, Gerard was hailed as a martyr by some Catholic hardliners. Mainstream fact: William's murder shocked Europe and set a precedent for political assassination in the early modern era. It showed how faith and politics could inspire not just armies, but individuals willing to strike alone. Quirky tidbit: William's last words were reportedly in French. Mon Dieu, ayez pitié de moi et de mon pauvre peuple. My God, have mercy on me and my poor people. They were so moving that Dutch rebels adopted him as a national hero for centuries to come. Daggers weren't the only weapons of medieval assassins. Poison played a crucial role, especially in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where politics was as dangerous as war. Families like the Borgias became infamous for allegedly slipping venom into wine cups or meals. Though many stories were exaggerated, enough people died suddenly at feasts and councils that poison became a symbol of treachery. Medieval manuals even detailed recipes: arsenic mixed with vinegar, ground glass hidden in honey, or herbs brewed into deadly concoctions. Unlike daggers, poison left no public spectacle, only whispers and suspicions. That made it both feared and despised. Here lies the great debate. To rulers, assassins were criminals, cowards, and heretics. To the people suffering under tyranny, they were sometimes saviors. After all, what army could ever reach a king's guarded chamber? But one man with a blade might. Historians argue over whether assassination destabilized societies or prevented greater wars by removing dangerous leaders. The assassins of Alamut, for example, claimed they targeted only oppressors. Yet their methods spread fear so deeply that even mentioning their name could silence enemies. Now imagine being a soldier in a medieval army, guarding your king at night. You're armed, armored, loyal. But deep down, you know, if an assassin wants him dead, there may be nothing you can do. A disguised servant, a poisoned goblet, a shadow in the corner. The king himself might sleep uneasily, knowing the most wanted weren't always armies, but individuals with nothing to lose. What does loyalty feel like when your ruler is one dagger away from death? And what does fear look like when the enemy doesn't wear banners or march to drums, but moves in silence? Were medieval assassins the villains of history, spreading fear and chaos? Or were they products of their times, using the only weapon the powerless had against the powerful? The truth is murky. The Nizari assassins, the knights who killed Becket, the conspirators in Byzantine palaces, they all believed they had reasons, often couched in faith or justice. But kings and chroniclers wrote the official record, and in those pages, assassins became monsters lurking in the dark. And yet, without them, history might have taken very different turns. You step carefully now, listening for footsteps that might not be yours. Behind you are zealots with their whips and prophets with their flames. Around you, shadows still linger, filled with whispers of daggers and poison. Ahead, however, lies an even stranger part of the king's ledger. Not rebels or killers, but outlaws, folk heroes and thieves who lived beyond the law. Men and women who robbed kings, mocked sheriffs, and danced in the forests where no crown could reach. The next names on the most wanted list didn't hide in castles or cathedrals. They hid under greenwood trees. And the people, rather than fearing them, often cheered. The road finally spills out of the shadows of cathedrals and the blood-soaked chambers of kings, and into the wide, breathing forests. The moon shines silver over the leaves, and you hear the rustle of deer in the underbrush, the whisper of streams tumbling through roots. For the first time in your journey, the air smells of freedom, pine, oak, moss, and campfires hidden far from the eyes of sheriffs. But freedom comes at a price. And in the medieval world, the price was being branded an outlaw. Kings could not tolerate men and women who lived beyond their laws. Yet paradoxically, these outlaws often became beloved. The crown wrote their names in angry ink on most wanted lists, but ballads sang of them with warmth, and villagers whispered their deeds by hearthlight. Tonight, as you pass under the boughs, you enter their world, the Greenwood, the refuge of thieves, rebels, and folk heroes. We start, of course, with the most famous outlaw of all, Robin Hood. He's almost too famous, too neat, as though history sculpted him for bedtime stories. But peel back the layers, and he's a tangle of ballads, legends, and maybe a few crumbs of truth. Mainstream fact: the earliest surviving mentions of Robin Hood date to the late 14th century, in ballads like A Jest of Robin Hood. These songs already show him living in Sherwood Forest with his merry men, robbing the rich and helping the poor. But they don't get mention made Marion or King Richard. That came later. Quirky tidbit: in some of the earliest versions, Robin isn't as noble as you think. He robs monks, kills sheriffs, and sometimes comes off more as a bloodthirsty bandit than a gentle benefactor. It was only centuries later that writers polished him into a charming rebel in green tights. Historians still argue whether Robin was based on a real figure, perhaps an outlaw in Yorkshire, or even a composite of many rebels. Some suggest Robin Hood was just a stock name used for criminals in court roles, kind of like John Doe. But here's what matters. To medieval commoners, Robin represented defiance. He thumbed his nose at sheriffs, abbots, and corrupt officials. He lived where law couldn't touch him, the forest, wild and free. And no king, no matter how many warrants were issued, ever caught him. That's why Robin sits near the top of any most wanted list. If Robin is the polished outlaw of English imagination, Eustace the monk is his chaotic cousin, the prankster who slipped between monks' robes and pirate sails. Born in Boulogne around 1170, Eustace started as a Benedictine monk, but the cloister didn't suit him. He left or was expelled, depending on the source, and soon became infamous for his trickery and banditry. Chronicles describe him as a master of disguise. One story claims he once disguised himself as a leper to escape capture, another that he turned himself into a horse dealer, yet another that he used sorcery to make himself invisible. Whether fact or fable, you get the sense medieval folk relished imagining him as unstoppable. Mainstream fact: by the early 13th century, Eustace had taken to the sea, becoming a pirate in the English Channel. He served both England and France at different times, switching sides when it suited him. His fleet raided towns, ships, and coastlines, and he grew so powerful that kings issued repeated orders for his capture. Quirky tidbit: one chronicle claims he once trained pigs to carry torches on their tails, then drove them into an enemy camp, causing chaos and fire. Historians doubt it, but it's a delightful mental image, an outlaw using flaming pigs as medieval grenades. Eustace met his end in 1217 at the Battle of Sandwich, captured by English forces. They offered him a choice of execution, beheaded by sword or axe. He chose the sword. Even in death, he held on to style. Not all outlaws were peasants. Some were knights stripped of lands and titles, turning rebellion into survival. Fulk Fitzwarren, born around 1160, was one of these. After a dispute with King John, the same king who haunts Robin Hood stories, Fulk fled into the forests and waged his own private war against the crown. Chroniclers describe him ambushing royal officials, raiding convoys, and seizing castles with small bands of followers. Mainstream fact: the story of Fulk became so legendary that it was written down as a romance in the early 14th century, the Romance of Fulk Lugh Fitzwarren. It blurs fact and fiction, but it shows how his deeds captured the medieval imagination. Quirky tidbit: in the romance, Fulk once disguises himself as a charcoal burner to sneak into Shrewsbury, fooling the townsfolk before launching a raid. It's the kind of tale that made listeners grin, imagining nobles humiliated by a clever outlaw. Historians still argue whether Fulk was truly a people's hero, or just another ambitious baron out for himself. But his inclusion on the king's most wanted list was certain. He represented not just lawlessness, but defiance from within the nobility itself. Why did so many outlaw stories center on the forest? Sherwood, Arden, the Welsh Hills, the Breton Woods, they all became stages for rebellion. Part of the reason is practical. Forests offered cover, food, and escape routes. They were also legally complicated. Much of the forest in medieval England wasn't just woodland, but land under special royal law. That meant hunting a deer without permission was a crime. To live in the forest was, by definition, to live outside the king's law. But the forest also had symbolic power. To peasants, it was freedom from lords and sheriffs, a space where community rules mattered more than royal edicts. Outlaw tales thrive here because the Greenwood was the one place the crown couldn't fully control. Think about it. Why do kings hate outlaws so much? It's not just the theft. It's the popularity. An outlaw could become more beloved than the king himself. Robin Hood, Eustace the Monk, Fulk Fitzwarren, all became household names, not because they terrified peasants, but because peasants rooted for them. Every stolen coin from a greedy abbot, every sheriff humiliated in the forest, it was catharsis. That's why outlaw tales survived. People whispered them, sang them, and passed them on even as sheriffs nailed wanted posters to trees. The more the crown hunted them, the larger their legends grew. Did Robin Hood ever exist? Was Eustace really a sorcerer or just a clever pirate? Was Fulk Fitzwarren a hero of the people or a selfish rebel noble? The debates rage on. But here's the twist. The uncertainty is part of the magic. Outlaws live best in the blurred line between fact and fable. To pin them down would be to tame them, and that's the one thing they refused in life. The firelight of an outlaw camp fades behind you as you step out of the trees. The night grows colder now, and you hear the toll of distant bells. You've left the freedom of the Greenwood and are heading back toward the places where law is sharpest. The courts, the prisons, the dungeons where kings locked away those they could not kill. The next names on the most wanted list weren't rebels running free or assassins striking fast. They were prisoners, men and women caged, tortured, broken, and sometimes forgotten. Their stories are written not in songs of freedom, but in iron chains. The night air grows colder as you leave behind the open freedom of the forests. The sound of laughter and ballads fades, replaced by the metallic echo of chains, the low creak of timber doors, and the muffled groans of the forgotten. You step from Greenwood freedom into the cold, stone grip of captivity. Here on the King's Most Wanted list are not rebels galloping free, but prisoners dragged into dungeons, sometimes surviving, sometimes vanishing, sometimes becoming legends simply because no one ever saw them again. The medieval world loved its prisons almost as much as its gallows. Not necessarily as places of punishment, but as holding pens, spaces where political enemies could be silenced without the mess of a public beheading. A king could claim mercy by sparing a life, but the truth was often worse. Years spent in darkness, locked in towers, whispered about in rumor, until the prisoner became half ghost, half myth. If there is one place that defines medieval imprisonment, it is the Tower of London. Rising grim and grey on the Thames, it wasn't just a fortress. It was a symbol of royal authority, where the most dangerous or inconvenient names on the king's list were tucked away. Mainstream fact, the tower housed prisoners from the 12th century onward, including high nobles, bishops, and even kings. Some were executed after trial, but many lingered in cells for years. Quirky tidbit, not every prisoner lived in misery. Wealthy nobles could sometimes bribe their guards and enjoy decent meals, servants, even books. There's record of a prisoner keeping a pet cat and another growing a small garden in a courtyard. The tower was as much a hotel for the rich as a death sentence for the poor. Historians still argue whether the tower was more feared for its executions or its silence. After all, when someone entered those gates, the city might never see them again. Not all captives were men. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, spent over 15 years imprisoned by her own husband, Henry II of England. Why? Because she sided with their rebellious sons against him. Imagine the drama. Queen Consort of England, Duchess of Aquitaine, mother to Richard the Lionheart and King John, locked away in castles across England like some dangerous outlaw. Mainstream fact, Eleanor was finally released when Richard inherited the throne in 1189. She emerged from imprisonment not broken, but fiercer, acting as regent, negotiating treaties, and even riding across Europe in her 70s. Quirky tidbit, while imprisoned, she supposedly embroidered, read romances, and kept a tight grip on her political contacts. Even caged, Eleanor schemed. And here's the debate. Did Henry imprison her purely as punishment, or was it strategy to neutralize her influence without risking scandal by executing a queen? Historians still argue. Speaking of Eleanor's son, Richard himself famously spent years as a prisoner. After fighting in the Third Crusade, he was captured in 1192 by Duke Leopold of Austria, who turned him over to Emperor Henry VI. Imagine it, the heroic Crusader king, celebrated in songs across Europe, chained in a castle dungeon. England had to raise an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks, equal to several years of royal income, to buy his freedom. Taxes soared, gold and silver were stripped from churches, and the people groaned under the burden. Mainstream fact, the ransom was paid, and Richard was freed in 1194, though the scars on England's treasury lingered. Quirky tidbit, legend claims his loyal minstrel Blondel discovered his location by singing outside castle walls until Richard answered with the second verse of their favorite song. Historians doubt this charming tale, but it's the kind of story that makes captivity feel almost romantic. If the Tower of London has a ghost story, it's this. The two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, imprisoned in 1483 by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Soon after, the boys vanished. Mainstream fact, the princes were declared illegitimate, and Richard crowned himself Richard III. But no one ever saw the children again. Quirky tidbit, in 1674, workmen remodeling the tower found two small skeletons buried under a staircase. Were they the princes? Historians still argue. Some believe Richard III had them murdered. Others insist Henry VII, who later defeated Richard, may have been the true culprit, eager to erase rival claimants. Either way, the mystery made the boys eternal most wanted, not because they escaped, but because their fate was never confirmed. You've met prophets, zealots, and rebels on this road, but Joan of Arc's imprisonment is one of the most famous of the medieval age. Captured in 1430 by Burgundian forces, she was sold to the English, who locked her away in Rouen Castle. Mainstream fact, Joan was denied the protection usually given to prisoners of war, treated instead as a heretic and witch. She was chained to her bed, interrogated for months, and denied legal counsel. Quirky tidbit, Joan complained bitterly about being guarded by men rather than women, knowing the danger this posed. She even leapt from a 70-foot tower in a desperate escape attempt, surviving with only minor injuries. Historians still argue whether her trial was purely political theater or if her judges truly believed she was a dangerous sorceress. Either way, her imprisonment ended in execution, yet her name, rather than vanishing, blazed brighter. There's something haunting about prisoners who simply disappear. Medieval records are full of names that enter prison rolls, but never leave them. Did they die in chains, their bones crumbling in forgotten corners? Were they quietly executed and buried? Or did some slip away in daring escapes? One story tells of Ranulph Flambard, Bishop of Durham, imprisoned in the Tower in 1100. He supposedly escaped by hosting a banquet for his guards, getting them drunk, and then climbing down a rope smuggled in inside a wine cask. Such tales show the thin line between captivity and legend. Step inside a medieval cell. The walls are damp, sweating with moss. The air stinks of straw and rot. Rats scurry across the floor, gnawing at scraps. A prisoner huddles in the corner, chained by wrists or ankles. Time stretches endlessly, day and night blur, marked only by the slop of food through a slot or the scrape of boots outside. But not every prisoner suffered equally. Nobles had tapestries, feather beds, and even servants. Poor captives had lice, sores, and despair. A king's most wanted could live like a disgraced prince, or rot like an animal, depending on politics and wealth. Were medieval prisons truly instruments of cruelty, or were they more often places of negotiation, ransom, and politics? Unlike modern systems, imprisonment wasn't usually about punishment. It was leverage. Captives were bargaining chips, pawns in larger games. But the line between pawn and ghost was thin. You step back from the prison door, the sound of chains fading behind you. The cold night carries you onward, away from cells and towers, toward the final stretch of the King's List. Ahead lie the names who escaped law altogether, by disappearing into rumor, by never being caught, by becoming mysteries that linger to this day. The last march is toward shadows and silence, where the most wanted are not rebels or martyrs or prisoners, but enigmas whose stories were never closed. The road is almost at its end. From rebels in the forests to prophets at the stake, from queens in chains to warriors in exile, we have marched through the ranks of those deemed too dangerous, too inconvenient, or too inspiring to be left alone. But the King's most wanted list does not finish neatly. History is not a ledger with all debts settled. No, the final names are those that blur, those that vanish into silence. These are the figures who were never caught, never executed, never imprisoned, or whose stories trail off into mystery. They are the ones who slipped out of the King's grasp, fading into rumor and legend. The last is not about punishment, but about absence. About the thrill of the missing, about men and women who defied the neat conclusions rulers tried to impose. If chains and dungeons were meant to silence, disappearance was louder still. A vanished figure could haunt courts, taverns, and chronicles for centuries. In Wales, the name Owain Glyndwr still burns like a coal. He rose in 1400 against Henry IV of England, declaring himself Prince of Wales. His rebellion lasted more than a decade, with guerrilla battles, ambushes, and fiery speeches. For a time, Glyndwr controlled much of Wales, and even sought alliances with France and Scotland. He was proclaimed in Welsh poetry as a liberator, a man chosen by destiny. But the rebellion collapsed. Castles fell, supporters were executed, and Henry IV's armies tightened their grip. And then, silence. Glyndwr was never captured. Mainstream fact, by 1412, his rebellion had fizzled, and he disappeared from the record. The English crown offered large rewards for his capture, dead or alive. No one ever collected. Quirky tidbit. Local tradition insists Glyndwr lived out his final years quietly under an alias, possibly hiding with relatives. One tale places him disguised as a shepherd. Another claims he lived with his daughter in Herefordshire, slipping unnoticed among ordinary villagers. Historians still argue. Did he die in obscurity, buried in a hidden grave? Or did he deliberately vanish to become a symbol rather than a failure? Even centuries later, Glyndwr's ghost lingers in Welsh nationalism, the rebel king who refused to give the crown his defeat. Not all missing names were rebels. Some were dreams, phantoms invented to inspire hope or justify wars. One of the strangest, most wanted figures of the medieval age was not a man at all, but a myth, Prester John. For centuries, Europeans believed in a mysterious Christian king ruling a vast, wealthy kingdom somewhere in the East, India, Persia, later Ethiopia. Letters supposedly written by him circulated, describing rivers of gems, armies of 10,000 knights, and lands where griffins and phoenixes roamed. Why did he matter? Because Europe was obsessed with finding him. In the age of the Crusades, Prester John represented the idea of a powerful ally who could attack Islam from behind, squeezing Muslim states between Christian West and East. Kings, popes, and knights dreamed of his aid. Mainstream fact: dozens of expeditions were launched to find Prester John. None succeeded. Quirky tidbit: when Portuguese explorers reached Ethiopia in the 15th century, they briefly thought they had found him. Letters were exchanged with the Ethiopian emperor, who must have been deeply confused at being mistaken for a myth. Historians still argue, was Prester John pure fantasy, a political invention, or a garbled rumor of real Eastern rulers? In any case, he was one of the strangest names on Christendom's mental wanted list, the king they sought desperately, but who never existed. Some names on the margins are not kings or generals, but mysteries whispered by peasants. In the 12th century, villagers in Woolpit, Suffolk, claimed to find 2 children, brother and sister, wandering out of a pit. Their skin was green, their clothes were unlike anything locals recognized, and they spoke in a strange language. The children were taken in. Eventually, they learned English and explained they came from a land of perpetual twilight called the Land of St. Martin. The boy died young, but the girl grew up, learned to eat normal food, and supposedly married. Mainstream fact: chroniclers like Ralph of Coggeshall recorded the tale as true. Quirky tidbit: the girl claimed that in her land, everything was green, and the sun never shone as it did in England. Historians still argue, were these children malnourished Flemish refugees, victims of poisoning, or an early medieval UFO tale? Either way, they became wanted in chronicles not because they threatened kings, but because they represented the unknown, the strange intruding on the ordinary. After the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror claimed Harold Godwin's son, the last Saxon king of England, was dead. Bayeux tapestry scenes show Harold struck by an arrow in the eye, then cut down by Norman knights. His body was supposedly mangled beyond recognition, but rumors refused to die. Mainstream fact: William allowed Harold's mother to bury his body, though some chroniclers say no one could confirm which corpse was his. Quirky tidbit: later stories claimed Harold had survived, living as a hermit in Chester or as a pilgrim wandering Europe. One 12th century account describes a monk on his deathbed confessing he was Harold. Historians still argue, was Harold killed outright, or did the Saxon king slip away into obscurity? The persistence of the rumor shows how desperately people clung to the idea of their fallen king still alive. Another strange presence on medieval lists were not individuals, but archetypes, outsiders believed to wander eternally. The legend of the Wandering Jew emerged in the 13th century, describing a man cursed to live until the second coming for mocking Christ on the road to Calvary. Mainstream fact: the tale spread across Europe, with chroniclers identifying wandering figures as this eternal man. He was said to appear in different kingdoms, always restless, never able to die. Quirky tidbit: in some versions, he gave prophecies to kings. In others, he was hunted or avoided as a sign of doom. Historians still argue, was this story a product of anti-Semitism, folklore, or a symbolic way of grappling with time and sin? Either way, the Wandering Jew became a kind of eternal fugitive, most wanted not by kings, but by the weight of myth itself. Not all vanishings were mysterious. Some were real and recorded, like prisoners who outwitted their captors. We've already met Ranulph Flambard, the bishop who escaped the Tower of London using a wine cask and a rope. But there were others. One tale tells of Alexander III of Scotland's enemies capturing him as a boy. He was smuggled out of their control by loyal supporters, whisked across rivers and forests until he was crowned. Another tells of nobles leaping from castle walls into rivers, breaking free into exile. But for every recorded escape, there are dozens of names and roles and parchments who simply vanish. Tax collectors disappear mid-journey. Knights vanish in battle with no body found. Sailors disappear at sea. Chroniclers often leave them hanging. He was never seen again. that haunts the line like a ghost. To medieval rulers, disappearance was maddening. A dead enemy was one thing, body displayed, rebellion quenched. But a vanished enemy lingered. People whispered, "He's not dead. He'll return." Rumors of return fueled uprisings, gave hope to rebels, and destabilized crowns. Arthurian legends themselves are rooted in this power. King Arthur is not dead but sleeps in Avalon, waiting to return when Britain needs him most. Countless rulers feared a sleeping king, myth attaching itself to a vanished rival. Vanishing turned the most wanted into eternal phantoms. They became untouchable, not because of power in life, but because of uncertainty in death. What do we do with these figures who slip away? Some historians insist they should be dismissed, mere rumor, myth, or propaganda. Others argue their importance lies not in whether they lived or died, but in how people believed in them. After all, belief itself shaped rebellion's policies and hopes. Perhaps that's the final truth. The king's list of most wanted was never about individuals, but about control over stories. Rebels, prophets, prisoners, and vanishing legends were dangerous not because of their swords or chains, but because of what people believed about them. You walk onward past the cells and forests, past the battlefields and thrones, until the road narrows. The names behind you echo like chants: Robin, Joan, Eleanor, Owain, Harold. Some died, some burned, some rotted in towers, some vanished into shadows. But all of them remain. The king's list was never complete, never final. Each name lingers, passed on in songs and whispers, in debates of historians who still cannot close the book. And so you come to the last step, the winding down of the tale, where history blurs into memory and memory into legend. The march is over, but the echo of footsteps remains. The road grows quieter now. You've walked the long corridors of castles, slipped through the forests where outlaws hid, and listened to the crackle of fires where heretics met their end. Kings kept their lists, wrote their edicts, sent their guards storming through the night, but somehow the names still escaped. Some by vanishing, some by dying dramatically, and some by slipping into song and legend. Think back to them: Robin, cloaked in green; Eleanor, daring to outwit kings; Wallace, shouting freedom on a scaffold; Joan, listening to voices no one else could hear. Even the ones who blurred into rumor: Glyndwr, the vanished prince; Harold, the maybe-not-dead king; Prester John, the phantom ally. They all show you one thing. Power never rests easy. It always feels hunted, even by whispers. You can almost hear the kings muttering in their halls, worried that rebels will rise again, that saints will be believed more than crowns, that vanished enemies will return at dawn. That fear, in the end, made the most wanted not criminals, but symbols. And maybe that's the trick history plays. The more a ruler tries to silence a name, the louder it echoes centuries later. You lying here now, in another time, another world, still trace those echoes in your mind. So let the march fade. Imagine the torches dying out, the scrolls rolling up, the last wanted posters curling in the damp. History is quieter now, softer, like a page gently closing. You can set the weight down. The road is behind you, the whispers only faint. The kings are gone. The names are safe. Sleep well, traveler. Sweet dreams.